Welcome to the Israel Report. I'm Ashley Church from the Israel Institute of New Zealand, and I'm with Dr David Cumin, a fellow director of the Institute. David, tell us a little bit about what the Institute does.
Well, the Israel Institute of New Zealand is an independent think tank, and we're dedicated to providing New Zealanders with a better understanding of the state of Israel through accurate analysis, insightful commentary and effective advocacy. There's been a few things since we last spoke to catch up on.
So David, I want to start by talking about the events in Israel overnight with the firing by Hamas of 150 missiles into Israel. That follows the firing of 200 missiles into Israel back in July, and of course back in May a further 50 fired into Israel, and on each of those occasions, certainly the first two, a kindergarten was hit, in the second round of attacks a playground was hit, and yet on none of those occasions has there been any condemnation from the New Zealand government, which has been vociferous in its criticism of Israel. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's really disappointing, and this is in contrast to many other countries we know have come out and publicly condemned terrorism from the Arab Palestinians in Gaza. It's really disappointing that New Zealand doesn't seem to think that warrants a public statement.
Is it reasonable to call it bias?
Yeah, I would say so. And this is not only manifest in not condemning the terrorism publicly, but also in the UN votes that New Zealand has had, which we can touch on as well. But specifically in this round, this recent barrage from the terror groups that are in Gaza, there have been 9 casualties in Israel, so there are 9 people that are injured, and even if there weren't, it's still something to step up and say, we don't support terror. When Simon Bridges comes out and says that New Zealand was wrong to sponsor 2334, but we shouldn't allow Israel a free pass. My question to him and to the New Zealand government is, why are you giving terror a free pass?
And it's interesting, and you mentioned before the UN bias, and so if we look at 2017, there were 21 resolutions against Israel that year, just 6 against every other regime on the entire planet, and of those 21 resolutions, New Zealand voted in favour of 17 of them and abstained on 4. So again, this ongoing suggestion of bias on the part of the New Zealand government.
Yeah, and in contrast to our traditional allies, the United States, Canada, Australia, liberal democracies, we know that the United Nations is made up of 193 nations, and not all of them, very few of them actually, are liberal democracies.
No,
and so
a lot of them not run by good people.
Not at all,
Right.
and we should expect our country that is run by good people to be showing that and to be not joining the mob, as we've said and as we've called out.
I guess the concern in this is that New Zealand's had a very proud tradition of being a very principled nation for a long period of time. It was one of the 33 nations that first voted in favour of petitioning the creation of Israel. But in respect of so many other issues in recent years, it's been a country that we could rely on to stand up and have a strong ideological and principled position. And yet we're seeing over the last 3 or 4 years the erosion of those values and, as I say, the suggestion of bias, particularly with the nation of Israel.
Yeah, and it's a clear example. I think the history is right. New Zealand has been generally supportive of Israel, historically speaking. Even Phil Goff, when he was Foreign Affairs Minister, was condemning Arab-Palestinian terrorism in the early 2000s. And so there really does seem to have been a shift in policy, a shift in thinking. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if these are the ministers themselves or if it's their advisors who are suddenly giving them different advice. I'm not sure whether it's also that quote, I forget who said it, but New Zealand's foreign policy is its trade policy. And of course the recent comments from the United States putting sanctions back on Iran and talking about clamping down on the world's largest state sponsor of terror, New Zealand doesn't seem to be falling into line, and I wonder what your take on that is.
Well, it's interesting, and you make the comment about trade being the basis of our policy, and I think in most cases Kiwis would generally support that, because that's something that's obviously been part of this whole process of making the country more independent and potentially wealthier. The problem with that is that there are times when principle's got to take precedence over trade, where you've actually got to focus on the ideology behind the issue and actually focus on what's really important. And it seems to me, and by listening to you, obviously you have the same view, that we seem to be losing focus on that and putting much more of a focus now either on lucre or on positions which are fundamentally wrong and proven to be so.
Yeah, and there's no reason to continue the humanitarian trade, which is what New Zealand wants to do with Iran, but I haven't heard a New Zealand official condemn Iran for either their sponsor of terrorism outside of the country or even their domestic human rights abuses, and it was shameful that John Key a few years ago covered up the hanging of homosexuals in Iran by saying that they were drug dealers. It's that kind of double standards, I think, that really is not the Kiwi way.
What would you like to see happen? What would you like the government to do now?
Well, I would like the New Zealand government to condemn terror, and whether that's coming from the Arab Palestinians in Gaza, from the terror groups there, whether that's coming from Iran and its sponsorship, I'd like them to step up. We've seen Hezbollah supporters in Auckland, and only 2 MPs have stood up and said, that's not right, that's not the Kiwi way, this is something that we need to oppose. And I'd like to see our government take human rights a little bit more seriously and actually condemn terror and the support of it.
So David, we know from surveys run by the Israel Institute that the support for Israel amongst average Kiwis, New Zealanders, is still very strong. And so that has, even through some of these changes over the last few years, Kiwis have continued to recognise the injustice of what's taking place in that part of the world. So given that the government's position is at odds with the public, why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not entirely sure. I think that poll was pleasantly surprising, at least to me, to know that the majority of New Zealand was supportive of Israel and only a very tiny percentage, 13, was against the state of Israel. So why do the politicians not reflect that? Why does the media not reflect that? That's a question for them and their advisors. So I think MFAT has a big role to play in this because ministers change, but these ideas seem to have been gaining ground over the years.
And so if this continues, if we have this continual bias in foreign policy that we've been seeing over the last 4 or 5 years by both governments, by both Labor and the previous national government, what do you think the implications of that are in the medium and long term?
Well, the implications for New Zealand may not be extremely massive, but the implications worldwide are, and it starts to be this insidious creep of slowly giving up principles and slowly giving up what we should be standing for as human rights. And as that erosion occurs, we've seen what's happened, for example, in the Labour Party in the UK, where the head of that particular party is a blatant anti-Semite. And that makes New Zealand not a safe space for Jews, which won't hurt the country necessarily immediately, but the Jews will not be the last people to suffer. So,
and David, speaking of New Zealand and its relationship with Israel, just in the last week or so we've seen the poffery and the apology to Israel by the Māori community. What's your take on that?
It was a beautiful event. It was really special and in some ways humbling, because it wasn't a Māori decision to co-sponsor 2334, and yet there was such a feeling of shame that New Zealand had done that Pat Rooker and others decided to apologise.
The Harawira family?
Some
of the Harawira family?
Some of the Harawira family. It was a beautiful event. It was very touching and a great symbol of not only the shared history and the shared cultures, but also the shared values of Māori and Jews as Indigenous people. It was wonderful. There was also another event that brought New Zealand and Israel closely together in some positive light, and that was the tennis tournament.
Oh yes.
So an Israeli and a Kiwi, and I forget their names, I'm sorry, but they'll be on our website, partnered as a doubles team and won the tennis tournament in Nottingham.
Fantastic stuff.
Long may that continue, and our two nations join together positively, either through sports or trade or any other route. It's great to see.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Ashley.